where she worked as a research assistant studying captive pallid bats. DeAndrea then followed that by beginning her career at the Houston Zoo in 2010. So over the past 10 years at the zoo, DeAndra has worked covering pollinator conservation, habitat restoration, public outreach, and education. And as a result of her Texas bat monitoring project, she was awarded the title of Conservation Champion. So presently, along with working at the zoo, DeAndra participates in conservation and education programs with the Buffalo Bayou Partnership. And all of this while balancing a family, a husband, and a 5-year-old son in Pearland. So tonight, she's going to enlighten us on bats. So please welcome me in joining DeAndra Ramsey as our guest speaker. Thank you for signing up for that, DeAndra. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. Excited to be here, even though it's a little bit of a virtual meeting. Rather be in person, but you know, we do what we can today. I need to be given access to share my screen again.
I'm working on it right now.
Okay.
I'd like to ask whoever is eating dinner, I can hear your plate. If you guys don't mind muting yourself if you're on a phone. Okay, you should have it, DeAndra.
Got it. Okay.
Now I'm good. And soon it's open my way.
All right, so before we get started, let's go ahead and make sure we are all muted. Can everyone see my title screen up there? Okay, I see people shaking their heads. Yes, wonderful. So again, my name is DeAndra Ramsey. I am a bat lover to the extreme. I am currently employed at the Houston Zoo as a conservation education coordinator. And I get the privilege of facilitating our school partnership program. I also take the charge on the Texas Bat Monitoring Project that the Houston Zoo does in conjunction with Bat Conservation International. I have a part-time side hustle, if you will, with the Buffalo Bayou Partnership as a deckhand and a bat ambassador. And then I am a member of the Houston Bat Team. So all of those things keep me pretty busy, but I love it. And I also have a little 6-year-old boy at home, and he had a birthday, so he is now 6. And whole house full of pets. And okay, yes, all right, okay, thank you, Beth. He heard me talk about him. So my husband and I live out here in Pearland, and it's wonderful because we have tons of bats out here. Now, a little bit of how I'm going to try to do this. I cannot see the chat window when I'm sharing my screen. So I am going to go through parts of my presentation, and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then take some questions from the chat window. That way we can have questions throughout our time together and not have to worry about muting and unmuting, because I'll just read them out of the chat box at certain times. So hopefully that goes smoothly. All right, oh, there we go. Okay, so some of the things that we're going to be talking about tonight are bat basics. Now, I'm sure that in a crowd this big, knowledge over bats kind of runs the gamut. I'm sure there's some of y'all out there that know more than I do about bats, but there might be some of y'all who kind of know what a bat is, but you're not too familiar with them. So we're going to go over the basics of bat biology, just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page. We're going to discuss some bat myths that have occurred throughout the centuries in various cultures, in addition to some bat myths that are still going on today. We're going to talk about the benefits of bats, why we should really want them around our neighborhoods, our ecosystems, and then we're going to end our time together talking a little bit about bats in today's world, in today's climate. They really need our help now more than ever, and we'll kind of throw out some ideas of how we can all be friends to our bats in the sky. So, bat basics. They are mammals, so they belong to the class Mammalia, and much like all mammals, they are covered in fur and hair. Again, I know we're starting basic, just stick with me here. So on your screen, you'll see 3 bats. Over here to the far left is a Mexican freetail, in the middle is an eastern red bat, and on the far right is a hoary bat. All 3 of those bats can be found in Houston. And as you can see, they all have their own sense of style. Their fur can be different colors, different lengths, but they are all super adorable with their fuzzy little bodies. Another part of being a mammal is having live birth and feeding your babies milk. And bats are no different than us in that aspect. Most bats have 1 pup a year, and then they nurse that pup the same way we would nurse our babies. They do not have a horned uterus, so they are not a litter-bearing animal. If you think of other mammals of that same size, think about gerbils, hamsters, things like that, they can have 8 to 10 babies at a time. Bats are not like that. Most of them just have 1 baby at a time. One of the notable exceptions are eastern red bats. They can have twins and even triplets sometimes, but when a mama bat has a baby, its birth weight can be up to a quarter of the mom's body weight. Now that is incredible to think about. I always like to give the analogy of that's similar to me having a 20-pound baby at birth. No, thank you. I would not sign up for that. My son was about 5 pounds at birth, and that was more than enough poundage for me. So since bat babies are such a large pup compared to their mom's body size, that mom would have a really hard time if she had multiple babies to take care of. Now, since they are mammals, they are endothermic, which means they can control their body temperature, and that allows them to live in a wide variety of habitats. They are found on every single continent on planet Earth, with the exception of Antarctica, and only penguins live there, and penguins are stupid, so no one cares about Antarctica. And I'm kidding. I know there are penguin lovers out there. I say that just to get a rise out of people. But they are found on every single continent and almost every single habitat, biome, ecosystem. They are. Oh. Okay. Now, if we go to their order, so we were talking about the class Mammalia and some of the things that were characteristics of bats in the class Mammalia. Their order is actually Chiroptera, which means handwing. They're the only living specimens of that order. So they have their very own order that they're a part of. And if you were to look at a cladogram, the next closest kind of branch of the phylogenetic tree would be primates. So a lot of times people ask me, what are they related to? Are they related to rodents? They're not. If you did have to say what they were quote unquote related to, it would be primates. We are their closest relatives still living today. Now, that being said, we're very distant relatives, but technically we are their closest living relatives. Another type of classification that you might hear thrown around with bats are what we call megabats and microbats. As their names kind of imply, a lot of it can be determined by size. Megabats typically are larger. They are what we consider old world bats. So Asia, Australia, Africa, they tend to be fruit eaters, whereas microbats are typically smaller, can be found in the New World, so South America, North America, and for the most part are insect eaters. Now, you may have noticed that I used a lot of ambiguous language there. I kept saying typically, most of the time, for the most part, and that's because within these classifications, you can definitely find exceptions to those guidelines. And that's why I have these classification names kind of in quotes, because there is such overlap, and you can kind of get a little muddy if you go too far into looking at megabats and microbats. Now, bat morphology. One of the things that people think of when you say the word bat is, of course, this little flying thing with wings. Their wings are their most prominent feature for most people. The bones of their wings are actually the bones of our arms. So if you look at that center picture of the skeleton, all of these arm bones are the exact same bones that you would find in our arm. And then these long bones right here are called their phalanges, their fingers, and they become elongated to support that wing membrane when they're flying. If you look all the way over to the right, you see a diagram of a human arm, a bat wing, and a bird wing. The bat wing is much more similar to the human arm than it is to a bird wing. And if you were to look at the mechanics of flight, when a bird flies, most of their movement comes from their shoulder. So if you were to hold your arms out kind of like a blade on either side of you and move up and down from your shoulder, that's how birds get most of their momentum and lift and movement. Bats, on the other hand, they get a lot of their movement from their wrist. So they flick their wrist, and those long phalanges or finger bones move those wing membranes. And so I always say that bats kind of fly with jazz hands, which makes them really cute if you think about it, flying through the air with their little jazz hands, dipping and diving and catching those bugs. Another very distinct part of their morphology is their face. Now, bat faces run the gamut. And you were talking to a bat lover, so I think every single face is adorable. Although I do have friends say that they are faces that only a mother could love. But if you look at the bat picture on the far left, those are fruit-eating bats. So their faces are very indicative of a fruit-eating species. They have very large puppy dog eyes. They have a longer snout that looks almost dog-like. Their ears are not as prominent. They are smaller and set farther back on their skull because they don't really have to chase down their fruit, right? Their fruit is what they eat, and it's just sitting there on the tree. So they sniff it out, they can look with their eyes, and they don't need to rely on the echolocation that the insect-eating bats do. Now, in contrast, if you look all the way to the right, you see this little guy has huge ears. I mean, he looks almost cartoon-like. That's how big his ears are. And if you had to guess, you would say that he is an insect-eating bat. He needs those large ears to be able to hone in on those bugs with those echolocation skills. And so he depends on his sense of hearing, and that's why his ears are so prominent. By contrast, look at his little eyes. His eyes are teeny tiny. They're almost diminutive. He can see, but he doesn't rely on his sense of vision as much as a fruit-eating bat does. And then if you look at the photo right here in the center, this handsome fella has a very unique nose. And even though it looks pretty silly, scientists believe that all of these facial folds and protuberances on their noses help funnel the sound waves back to their ears. Many times if you see a very, very odd looking bat that has all these kind of wrinkles and divots and weird things on their face, it's to help with the acoustics of their echolocation. So even that funny thing right there on his nose helps them get around and hunt for bugs at night. Now, we talked about how their face can give you a lot of hints as to what they eat. So I thought now would be a good time to talk about what they like to snack on. Bat diets are as diverse as the bats themselves. You can find bats that eat only nectar, so they're nectar-eating bats. Many people don't associate bats with eating nectar like a butterfly, but they do. There's also bats that eat fruit. So this little bat right here was a bat at the zoo who was having a good old time just motorboating a cantaloupe right there. He kind of staked out his claim on that big piece of cantaloupe and wouldn't let any of the other bats come and snack from it. He was hungry that day. Of course, there are bats that eat bugs. They are the ones who echolocate, like we were talking about. They hunt for those insects at night. They eat in the air, so they won't land and snack. They'll catch things, what we call on the fly, and then they'll gobble them down. And then take a look at these little nuggets on the right. These adorable babies in the right-hand picture are baby vampire bats. Yes, there are bats that eat blood. They do not suck blood. They don't have the ability to suck. They don't have hollow fangs. They can't drink from a straw, but they do lap up blood the way a dog would drink water. So typically what they will do is they'll wait till an animal is asleep. They will go up to that sleeping animal and they will make a tiny, tiny cut, a tiny incision. When we're talking tiny, we're talking paper cut. Most of the time, they don't even wake up the animal. And then once that cut starts to bleed, the bat will lick it up the way a dog licks up water. They have an anticoagulant in their saliva, which keeps the blood flowing. And then they will go on their way. Like I said, most of the time, the animal doesn't even wake up. Now, I do have to talk about the quote unquote danger of vampire bats. Many people say, well, aren't they dangerous? They are in the way that mosquitoes are, in the way that ticks are, in the way that leeches are. Anything that feeds on blood has the potential to transmit pathogens from one animal to the next. And that's where the danger lies within vampire bats. It isn't that they would bleed an animal dry, I mean, we're talking an animal that weighs less than a Coke can feeding off of a cow, right? There's no way that little bitty bat would take enough blood to hurt that cow. But they do have the potential to pass along pathogens, which is, something to note. There are also fishing bats. So there are quite a few species of bats that will get above a body of water and they'll fly across it and kind of drag their toes just on the surface to kind of mimic insects. The little fish will come up to the surface of the water thinking that they are getting a yummy bug, but instead the bat turns around, makes another pass, and then grabs the fish as the fish comes up to eat what they thought was an insect. So those are really neat kind of adaptations to get a fish dinner. And then, yes, there are even bats that will eat small mice, frogs, and things of that nature. So again, lots of diversity in their diets, in the way they get their dinner, and it's awesome to see how clever some of them have become. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now. If you see the chat box kind of icon down at the bottom of your screen, if you're on a laptop or a computer, you can type a question in there and I will take a few of them.
So the first question that's been posted is, I've heard Mexican freetail and Brazilian freetail used interchangeably. Are they one and the same?
Mexican freetail and what was the other one?
Brazilian freetail.
Brazilian freetail. I've heard those terms used interchangeably as well. And to the best of my knowledge, they are pretty much the same species depending on who you talk to. I'm really good friends with Colin Geiselman, who's from BCI, and she'll use those terms interchangeably. But I have talked to other people in the bat field who say that they are different species. Diana, what's your opinion on that?
So from what I understand, they're one and the same. There can be differences in the subspecies, but then I've also heard research done on the subspecies, and there's no difference. So I think it's a little bit up in the air, but from what I always jokingly say to people is Brazilian freetail is used pretty much worldwide. In Texas, because our bats migrate to Mexico, we're sort of stuck on the Mexican freetail name.
And I think that sounds, let's go with that. All right, so I see another one. What type of uterus does a bat not have? It was the horned uterus. So there are, in most mammals, there are two types of uterus. Horned, which are what cats and dogs have, and that's what allows them to have 8, 10, 12 babies at a time. If you were to cut them open and look at their uterus, it's got these kind of long kind of arms that shoot off the body of the uterus, and that's where all of the babies can kind of line up. Humans and bats have a lobed uterus. So like if you were to look at my uterus right now, it's just kind of like a sac almost. There's not those long arms coming off. And that's why we typically have one baby, maybe twins, every once in a while triplets, but nothing really more than that. Because that's when you start to see birth weights get really, really low, and it's hard for the mom and it's hard for the babies. Most primates have a lobed uterus. So chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, they only have one baby at a time. So, all right, let's see. Will y'all have access to the PowerPoint? Yes, I can share that.
Actually, we're recording it, so we can send out the link.
Okay.
Question that said, in Russian, bats are called flying mice. Is it a total misnomer, or are they related?
It is a total misnomer. They are not related at all. Like I said, we as primates are their closest relative. We're still distant, but we are their closest relative. Rodents are even farther away from them on a phylogenetic tree. So they are not related to rodents at all.
Another question is, are there brown bats in the Houston area?
I don't know.
We have big brown bats.
Yeah, we have big browns.
We don't have little brown bats.
Little browns, yeah.
So two different species.
Oh, so here's a good one. Vampire bat babies, do they nurse by sucking? Do they lose that ability when they mature? What diseases do they pass? So yes, all bat babies nurse by sucking, right? So they'll like suckle at a teat the same way any mammal would. When I was saying that vampire bats don't suck blood, there would be no way for a bat to make a wound on an animal and then like suck on it the way we would our finger, if that makes sense. So the way they get their blood isn't by sucking on a wound, it's by allowing the wound to bleed and then lapping it up from that little puddle of blood that would form near the cut. But yes, baby bats do suckle. And then what disease? Okay. What diseases do they pass? Any blood-borne pathogen disease. So like if they were eating from, so for vampire bats, there's 3 different species of vampire bat. They all live in Central America. Two of them feed primarily on avian blood, so the blood of birds. One feeds on mammalian blood, the blood of mammals. So like for instance, if a bat was feeding from a bird and that bird had an illness that was a bloodborne pathogen, and then that bat went to another bird, it could transfer that disease to that other bird. Again, it's the same thing that happens with mosquitoes. That's why mosquitoes are considered one of the most deadly animals on the planet, not because the individual mosquito hurts us, it's because they can give us malaria and yellow fever and all those other horrible diseases when they go from person to person to person, taking a little bit of blood from each of us. All right, I will take about two more. Will you talk about the white nose problem? Yes, I will, later in the presentation. In French, bats are, I'm not even going to try to say that word, which means bald mice in English. A lot of languages do have bats that are words for bats that mean basically flying rat. But again, they're not related to rats at all. How cold do they drop their body temp for torpor? That kind of depends on the bat. So I know depending on where you are in the country, the bats do different things to kind of mitigate the winter months. Sometimes bats will migrate. So for instance, here in Texas, a lot of our bats will migrate south to warmer climates. But in kind of the mid-range of the United States, I know some bats will actually migrate north just so they can get cold enough to enter into a true hibernation. But I'm not sure what temperature their bodies actually go down to. I know it's pretty low, especially the ones that enter into a true hibernation. But again, that's farther up north. All right, I'm going to share my screen again. All right, so we are going to go into bat myths. So we are going to talk a little bit about bat myths in cultures. So throughout the millennia, bats have been present in various cultures around the world, some good, some bad. So I'm sorry, Diana? I'm getting an annotation request.
I don't know what that means.
Should I approve or decline?
Decline it, DeAndra.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that.
Okay.
So in some cultures, bats were definitely seen in a negative light. A lot of the South American cultures would view a lot of nocturnal animals as either negative or negative neutral. And what I mean by that is they either saw them as agents of harm, like these were actually malicious things, or they saw them as kind of the go-between between our world and the next, whether you want to call that, hell or the other space. They would view it as, a bat would be coming to take their family member away. So a lot of cultures thought that, when you saw a bat, that meant you're about to lose someone because that bat had come to escort them on to the other place, which even though the bat itself wasn't harming your loved one, it was never a good feeling to think that that bat was coming to take away, your mom or something. But some cultures viewed bats in a more positive light. So a lot of Asian cultures viewed bats as a sign of a blessing, of wealth, of prosperity. And so a lot of wedding motifs would have bat symbols kind of in the design to bless the new couple with wealth and prosperity. And even in today's culture, we still have the bat making an appearance. So on your screen, you'll see two more modern day bats in our culture. On the left, you see vampire, Dracula, which again is more of a negative connotation. But then on the right, you see a superhero, right? Batman. He comes to save the day, and he's a good guy. But even when bats are depicted as the good guy, they're still kind of shady, right? Even Batman can be considered as kind of an anti-hero. Like, yeah, he's a good guy, but he kind of does some shady things, and he doesn't do his work in the light of day. So even our good guy bats are a little dubious sometimes. We also have bat myths that I'm going to call fake facts, or you can call them fake news, or whatever you want to term them. But these are myths that I hear over and over and over and over and over again from people that I engage with on a daily basis. So we're going to go through some of these. So bats are blind. They're not. This is a myth. They can see. The biggest argument I hear to support this myth is, well, if they can see, why do they use echolocation? And I always say they use echolocation for the same reason that we use a flashlight. It's dark. They can't see that well in the dark, and neither can we. So we use a flashlight, and they use echolocation. But they can see. And if you look at this adorable little fruit bat right here hanging next to the colorful enrichment items that we gave them, they engage with colors differently, the same way we would. Bats get caught in your hair. Again, that is false. It is not true. I have always had very, very long hair. The longest it's ever been was down past my waist, and I've never, ever had a bat get caught in my hair. They are extremely good flyers. They wouldn't get lost and end up in your hair. I'm not sure where that myth started, but I've never had one in my hair, and I've never known anyone to have one in their hair. Bats attack humans. Again, that's a myth. When most of the time when I hear this is from a story about someone who's swimming in their swimming pool at night, and they tell me a story of they were minding their own business, and out of nowhere, this bat came and started dive bombing them in the pool, and they had to run inside. Most likely, what was happening was that bat was going after a drink of water. Bats, when they wake up, they're thirsty, just like us. So one of the first things they do is they look for a drink. Now, bats can't drink from a puddle like a coyote would, right? So bats can't land and crawl to a puddle and then drink it like a dog and then fly off. They need to drink what we call on the fly. So they're looking for a body of water that has a large enough surface area for them to swoop down, kind of skim the water as they're flying. And then as they're skimming the water, they're licking up the water, and then that's how they get their drinks. When they wake up in our suburban neighborhoods, many times our pools look like a really nice place to get a drink. So they wake up, they see our pool, they're like, oh, cool, I'll go get a drink. They go to swoop down, and then we scream, and then I imagine that they scream as well, and then we get scared, and they get scared, and it's just this big, huge mess. But regardless, the bats are not attacking humans. Now, of course, if you ever see a downed bat, or any animal for that matter, you never, ever, ever want to approach it if you have not been trained to. Because any animal, bat, squirrel, raccoon, possum, if they are hurt or if they feel vulnerable and you try to handle them, they are most likely are going to to bite, to scratch, to try to defend themselves. And so another reason why I hear the bats attack humans is that somebody has tried to handle a bat and got bit because of it, which again, that's not just bats, right? That's any animal. You should never approach an animal that is in distress if you have not been trained to. The best thing to do is just observe it from afar, call for help, but don't put yourself in that situation to get bit by an animal that's scared. Another fake fact is bats have rabies, diseases, and are so dirty. Again, this is a myth. Bats are extremely fastidious at cleaning themselves. They spend just as much time cleaning themselves as our domesticated cats do. We've even seen them incorporate a grooming behavior into their social structure. So much like you would see chimpanzees groom each other to kind of strengthen those bonds between one another, we've witnessed bats doing the same thing, which is incredible. So bats themselves are extremely clean, and they take very good care of themselves. As far as rabies and diseases go, they can have diseases, right? They can have rabies, just like any mammal can. But just because they're a bat doesn't mean they are all disease-ridden and have rabies. The instance of rabies in bats is actually really, really low. Less than 0.5% of all bats have rabies. It's not as if they are just all flying sacks of rabies virus. That's not true. They do have diseases, but again, so do we. One of the things that makes bats so incredible is their ability to fight off diseases. I'm going to share with you a really interesting YouTube video that explains in pretty great detail why their bodies can fight off diseases in the ways that they can. And it deals with the cellular development of flight. It gets kind of technical, the video, but I'll share it with you later in the chat window if you want to kind of do a deep science dive as to why bat bodies are kind of primed to fight off diseases. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen again so we can take some more questions because I'm sure you all get tired of me just talking as much as I get tired of just talking to my laptop. All right, so does the Houston Zoo have captive bats? If so, what species? Yes, we do have two species of captive bats. We have Cebus shorttail and Pallas longtongue, I believe, last time I checked. Bats took a bad rap for this COVID mess. Yes, they did. And I will be discussing that in the next segment. Do you have something that can identify bat calls? Otherwise, how do you identify them? Yes, we do have things that can identify bat calls. It depends on how much you want to spend. We have, like, for instance, at the zoo, we have these little, I guess you would call them a toggle that you can put into an iPhone and into the USB jack, and it will tell you based on the calls what species are flying around. But as part of the acoustic monitoring work that I do at the zoo, we were able to spend the big bucks and get some really fancy acoustic monitoring devices there. But that's the main way we can tell who's around us. Visually, that's really hard. I don't know of anyone that can visually look at a bat flying at night and tell what species it is. Now, if you see a downed bat, of course, you could get a better look at it. But unlike birders, who can see a bird flying and tell by its feathers, what species of bird it is. Bats are a little tricky to do that with. Could bats provide options for virus cures for humans? Yes, and that is actually one of the things that scientists have been looking at for decades now, because given the fact that so many bats have the social biology of living in such close quarters with each other, they are extremely disease resilient, given that fact. If you look at humans, whenever we congregate in large numbers, we're constantly making each other sick, right? I mean, we spread things back and forth like no one's business. But we don't really see that in bats. And so scientists have been looking at that for a long time now. How do bats identify their young in a huge colony of millions? Oh, that's a good question, and it's amazing. Some of the bats that live in colonies, now not all bats do. There are some bats that are solitary. So like eastern red bats, they just kind of like to hang out by themselves. They don't live in large colonies. But Mexican free-tail bats, they do live in those huge, huge colonies. And they will put their babies in what we call a bat nursery, where all of the bat babies will kind of be in a ball together, and a few of the moms will stay behind on babysitting duty while the rest of the moms go out and eat for the night. And then when the moms come back, they will get on the outside of that baby ball and they'll call for their baby, and then their babies will start calling back. And it's incredible because they can recognize their baby's voice, and their baby can recognize their mom's voice. So very similar to, if I went to go pick up my son from kindergarten and I was like, JD, come here. The first thing he would do is he'd hear my voice, and he'd look for me. Well, those bats do the same thing. They can hear their mama's call and then go and find her on the edge of the bat baby ball. All right. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. And Diana, if you'll keep an eye on time for me, like if I need to wrap up, let me know.
You're fine.
Okay. All right, so this next section is going to be covering the bat benefits. Now, I know, or at least I hope that I am preaching to the choir. I hope that all of y'all have already drank the Kool-Aid, and you know how beneficial bats are to our ecosystems, to our planet. But just in case you had any doubts, we will go over a few of them. The bat diversity is incredible. Right now, hang on one second. I'm sorry about that. So right now, the number of different bat species is hovering right around 1390 is the last count I heard. Depending on who you're talking to, I've heard that number be quoted a little lower. But like last week, I was listening to a webinar and they said it was more accurate to be like 1420. But regardless, there's a lot of bat species on planet Earth. They are the second most diverse group of mammals. Does anyone want to type into the chat box what you think the first group of mammals are that's the most diverse? There it is, rodents. Yes. So rodents are the world's most diverse group of mammals, with a lot more species than that. But bats are a close second. And just having them on our planet increases the biodiversity astronomically. And as I'm sure you all know, Biodiversity cannot be overstated in its importance. Pest control. So we talked a lot about how our bats that live here around us eat a lot of bugs. A pregnant mom can eat their body weight in insects every single night because she's got to take care of herself and that growing baby. And they eat that every single night. That is astronomical. If you stop and think about how many bats there are and the fact that each one of those bats is just chowing down on insects all night long. Some estimates put their worth at about $3.7 billion a year in reduced crop damage and pesticide use. So every night they go out there and they do us a huge favor by eating so many of the critters that eat the crops that we depend on. They are pollinators. So most of our pollinating bats do live out in the western climates, so the desert region. None of them live here in Houston, but they pollinate the plants that open up at night. They help us obtain things like bananas and peaches. And if you ever partake of a margarita every now and then, nowadays it's a margarita from our front porch because we can't go to a Mexican food restaurant. Thank a bat. Without bats, we would not have tequila because they are the sole pollinator of the agave. So the next time you have a margarita, pour a little bit out for the bats as a thank you. And remember our flying friends as you responsibly partake of those beverages. They are very important seed dispersers. As I'm sure you all know, many animals kind of have the title of seed disperser, but bats are very special in that they are comfortable flying outside the canopy. What I mean by that is in the rainforest, a lot of seed dispersers like primates, lizards, different bird species, they do a great job at increasing the density of the forest, but those animals aren't very comfortable leaving the canopy. Whereas if you had a huge tract of rainforest that had been cleared for logging, one of the only animals that will be brave enough to go across that cleared land are bats. So they're the ones who are really responsible for increasing the area of the rainforest as opposed to the density, which is really awesome to think about. Those little guys are super important when you take into account what's happening to a lot of our rainforests around the globe. We need those bats flying over that cleared land, pooping out those seeds, because that's real talk, that's what they're doing. They're just pooping out seeds. All right. You may notice that I am taking more questions. I'm trying to stop more as the presentation goes on. All right. Do they go out in bad weather? Not really. Not if they can help it. For those of y'all that have been down to Wall Drive Bridge down in Houston, when it's really kind of yucky and cold and rainy, they just kind of stay in. They don't really feel the need to go out when the weather's bad. Now, I'm sure if it was bad weather multiple days in a row, they might get hungry enough to venture out, but they can go a night or two without eating. So I always say that they're just watching Netflix, staying home, staying cozy, and they're just waiting for the rain to pass. All right, any other questions? All right. We have so many people from all over the state. What is the closest place to you for viewing bats? Well, thankfully, Texas has the most bat species of any state in the United States. So I always say that Texas is the best state in the world. And if anyone tells you different, don't let them. But one of the reasons why Texas is the best state in the world is that we have the most bats. So regardless of where you live in the state, you have bats around you. Here in Houston, we have Wall Drive Bridge. If you live in Austin, there's the Congress Avenue Bridge. If you live out near Fredericksburg, there's Old Tunnel. There's Huntsville. There's a huge colony in some buildings in Huntsville. They're everywhere. I believe Texas Parks and Wildlife a few years back developed a bat viewing booklet that Diana, I think, can be found still. And it had a list of all of the best bat viewing places around Texas. And so I would definitely recommend checking out some of those spots as well.
Yeah, it's on the Texas Parks and Wildlife webpage. It's bat guide.
Yes, so check that out, and it'll tell you kind of where different bat roosts are found and located. But again, pretty much if you're anywhere in Texas, you have bats near you. You have them in your backyard, you have them under bridges. I live, like I said, out here in Pearland. We have a colony under one of our bridges. They are definitely our neighbors. All right, so I'm gonna go on back. Oops. There we go. All right, so that was the perfect segue into our next section, which is talking about the native Texans that we have in our skies and our native Houstonians. I know not everyone on this call is from the Houston area, but a lot of the bats we're going to be discussing in this section can be found throughout the state of Texas. So, like I said, we have 32 different species of bat that live here in Texas, the most of any other state, and 11 of those species live here in Houston. Now, people always gasp when I say that, and they say, "Oh, well, surely you mean around Houston, right? Like out further." No, I mean inside Houston. You could drive through downtown Houston and have the potential to encounter 11 different species of bat. We are doing acoustic monitoring at the Houston Zoo. For those of y'all not familiar with where the Houston Zoo is located, we are in the middle of the Texas Medical Center, which is surrounded by the museum district and downtown. So you can't get much more in the middle of Houston than the Houston Zoo is. And we have been partnering with Bat Conservation International since 2012 to monitor for the wild bats that are utilizing our zoo grounds at night. So our monitoring does not have anything to do with our collection animals, the animals that live at the zoo. All of our monitoring efforts are focused on wild bats that just like to hang out at the zoo because it's such an awesome place to be. If you look at the picture on the far left, on the table right in front of me is a picture of the monitor. So that is the acoustic device that records the calls. We place them all around at various points in the zoo. We leave them up for 4 nights. We get anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 audio files during that chunk of time. And then we analyze them through a software that will tell us what species we heard. One of the best things, in my opinion, about this project is that we have made it available to all staff to take a part in. So even though I lead it, anybody can sign up to assist me. And it doesn't matter if you are a keeper or if you are in housekeeping or if you are part of the senior executive team. We have had so many Zoo staff come out, help us move the monitors, and learn more about the bats that we have at the Houston Zoo. And they are always amazed with who we hear around our zoo grounds. Now, this is the software that we use for the project. It's called Sonobat. And when you run the audio files through, it gives you a readout similar to what you see on your screen. So the blue squiggly lines are a visual representation of the audio file. At the very top of the blue squiggly lines, you see TABR. That is the code for a Mexican free-tail bat. So basically, that's the software telling me that it thinks that this call, this audio file, came from a Mexican free-tail bat. This number right here, the 0.9993, that is the degree to which it is certain. So the software is saying, I am almost 100% sure that that was a Mexican free-tail bat. Sometimes the software isn't sure, and it will tell me that. And it'll say, it could have been an evening bat, could have been a hoary bat, we're throwing this out. Like, we're not even gonna give you this number because we're not sure. And then of course, from those 1,000 audio files, there are a lot of what we call trash files. So insects, car traffic, we are in the middle of a medical center, so life flight is always going over our zoo, the helicopters. So all of those trash files, the software does a really good job at kind of throwing those away, if you will. And it can do about 1,500 audio files in probably 2 or 3 hours, which is amazing because if I had to sit here and do it myself, for one, I think I'd go crazy. And for two, it would probably take me 6 months to do it because it's just insane. So I'm very, very glad that we have the software that will tell us who we're listening to. Now, on zoo grounds, we have heard 7 different species of bat just hanging out. The tricolored bat, which was called the Eastern Pipistrella, but it got a name change. I don't know, like Puff Daddy. I guess they just didn't want to be an Eastern Pipistrella anymore. The Mexican free-tail bat, evening bats, hoary bats, northern yellows, eastern reds, and silver-haired. So all of those adorable little guys have been hanging out at the zoo, enjoying themselves. And like I said, they're completely wild, so they can come and go as they please. We think that quite a few of them are living at the zoo. For instance, the northern yellows love to kind of hang out in palm fronds. We have a ton of palm trees at the zoo. But some of the bats may just be coming there to eat, but they might be roosting somewhere else. We're not sure, but we just know that we've heard these 7 species hanging out at the zoo. Now, of course, as you can imagine, we hear more activity in the summer months than we do in the winter months. So we record once a quarter. So like February, May, August, and November are the months that we record. And in the summer months, when it's nice and hot, we hear a lot of activity. In February, when it's kind of chilly and rainy and bleh outside, we don't hear as much activity. But one of the really neat things about our location here in Houston is that we have bat activity all year round. Our winters are mild enough that we have bats that just hang out, right? And they don't leave, they don't migrate. And so even in February, we still record bat calls. Compare that to Lincoln Park Zoo up in Chicago, who's also working with Bat Conservation International on this acoustic monitoring program, they stop recording in September and they don't start recording again until April because there's no point. It's too cold up there. So in their winter months, they don't hear any bats whatsoever, which again is just another reason why Texas is better than all the other states. All right. So I'm going to take some more questions. Do you recommend putting up bat houses? Yes, I do. If you get onto Bat Conservation International's website, they have a lot of good tips and tricks on how to build your bat house, what color to paint it, where to hang it. So I would definitely recommend putting up bat houses. And one thing I could say is don't get discouraged. I know people that have put up bat houses and they have bats move in the next day. I have people that have put up bat houses and it takes 7 years before they see their first bat for whatever reason. But just fight the good fight, do what you can do, and don't get discouraged if the little guys don't move in right away. So do palms make good bat homes? Yes, they do, depending on the bat species. So I talked about the northern yellow bats. So when you have palm trees, and the fronds will start to die off, and it gets that kind of ring of dead palm fronds. I'm not sure if y'all know what I'm talking about, but like there's the green palm fronds, and there's those brown ones that kind of hang down. It looks kind of like a ring of dead palm fronds around the trunk of the tree. That's where northern yellow bats really like to snuggle. So if at any point you can have parts of your tree that are maybe less than aesthetically pleasing, you can really help out wildlife. That's true for insects and birds and bats. Anytime you can leave old branches or dead foliage or anything like that, those types of materials provide excellent homes for a lot of our little guys. And unfortunately, in a lot of our suburban areas, we tend to immediately cut back and destroy anything that we think looks dead or dying, right? Like, oh, that's dead, let's cut it down. But then you just let it be there, then it can offer a home. Of course, the caveat to that is if it's like gonna hurt somebody, of course, cut it down. But you know, if you're doing it just because it looks ugly, leave it up. All right, are drones harmful to bats? That's a really good question. I haven't really seen much research on drones being harmful to bats simply because I don't think they're that prevalent. We are going to talk about wind turbines in a little bit and how they are detrimental to bats. But I haven't heard much about drones posing an issue. And if I had to guess, it wouldn't be simply because they're kind of a single point disturbance, if you will, to where a bat can easily avoid it. But that would just be my thought. Let's see. Oh, this is a good question. Is the geology of Texas, the limestone caves, for example, one reason for the large number of species? That is a really good question, and it definitely doesn't hurt, right? A lot of our geology, our ecology, kind of makes us a prime location for many different bird and bat species. Just where we're located, kind of on our continent here, we are set up to have so many different types of ecosystems within our state borders, and we're in the flyway zone for so many different types of animals, insects, birds, bats. You can kind of see them all utilizing Texas in different ways at different times of the year. And I'm sure, one of the things that they love is our geology, our limestone caves. Do you know anything about the bat houses built in Huntsville? Um, if I'm thinking of what you're referring to, I do know that is a building in Huntsville owned by the prison, I think, that had a very large bat colony in it. And to the best of my knowledge, the prison wants to tear it down or is in the process of tearing it down. But because of the large colony that resides in that building, they were, as far as I know, going to be building large bat structures in hopes that when they tear the building down, the bats will have somewhere to go. That's as much as I know on the subject. I haven't been out to Huntsville to see the colony personally, but that's what. Oh, okay. Someone just said they have built the bat houses, but they haven't taken to them. Yeah, that happens sometimes. All right. So gonna jump back into the presentation. All right. So we've been discussing how bats are wonderful, amazing little guys, little critters, and they do so much for us. But unfortunately, the truth of the matter is they need our help more now than ever. Almost a third of all bat species are either threatened, endangered, or data deficient. Now, all that means is that the governing bodies that kind of make the call as to whether or not something is stable, endangered, vulnerable, threatened, they just don't know enough. So many bat species are being discovered every day. I mean, just when I talked about the number of bat species that we have, right? Like I talked about the varying numbers. And I mean, even within the past 10 years, we've discovered so many new species of bat. And when we're making these discoveries, it's hard to say whether or not those species are doing okay because we just don't know enough about them. So it's kind of daunting to think about a third of 1,390 different bats are either threatened or we just don't know enough about them. Some of the challenges facing them are with the white nose syndrome, which I'm sure y'all have all heard about. It's a horrible, horrible disease that started up in New York State in 2007 and has basically taken over North America and worked its way west, just at an alarming rate. And I remember for the longest time, we were wondering, how's it moving? How's it moving? And then it kind of stalled a little bit around Kansas, and we thought, okay, well, maybe it won't move anymore. And then it jumped over the Rocky Mountains and it appeared in Washington State. And we were like, okay, like it's on people's gear, people are moving it around. Because that was the only explanation for that jump over the Rocky Mountains to pop up over in Washington State. It's still an issue. It's still doing a number on our North American bats for sure. It has been found in Texas, unfortunately. BCI, Bat Conservation International, Texas Parks and Wildlife, a lot of different people are working really hard to try to figure out how we can get a handle on it. But unfortunately, it's a tough nut to crack. Wind turbines are another threat that bats are facing. They have massive mortality rates around wind turbines. people go out there and the ground is just littered with bat carcasses, more so than birds. And we're working to see why that is. I saw an infrared camera video one time showing birds flying through a wind turbine, and they just flew through. Some of them got hit, but some of them made it through and then continued on their way. And then they showed this one video, and the heat signature was from a bat, and the little bat just kept flying back and forth. So it would fly through, and if it made it, it would turn around and fly through again, and then turn around and fly through again, until eventually it didn't make it and it got hit. And so many people are suspecting that maybe the change in pressure around the wind turbines disorienting the bats or confusing them. But it's definitely an issue for our little bat friends. And then this is probably a slide that I've used for a long time that only came into importance given the light of the pandemic. When I would give this talk prior to March of 2020, I would somewhat gloss over this slide. I would just mention it because it wasn't that important to people in Texas, right? Habitat loss and bushmeat commercial trade. Habitat loss is pretty self-explanatory, right? Even here in North America, native habitats are being disrupted. And when you think about a single bat roost can have millions of bats in it, even if you just degrade one bat roost, you're having a massive impact on bat population. And they are extremely slow reproducers. We already talked about how they only have one baby a year. So if you were to have an event that killed off a large number of bats, it takes them a long time to kind of bounce back from that. And then also in other parts of the world, Southeast Asia, Africa, South America, where you have huge logging and palm oil plantations kind of doing their thing, in those parts of the world, we're destroying a lot of habitat for bats and other wildlife. Bushmeat and commercial trade. For those of y'all that don't know, bushmeat is just a term that we use to classify the eating of non-domesticated animals. So like primates. So for instance, in a lot of African cultures, they'll go out and they will hunt primates and different antelope species for sustenance, for food. And that's considered the bushmeat trade. But then in other parts of the world, you have the commercial trade, where they are going out into these forests and they are catching these different species, whether they be primates or civets or pangolins or bats or snakes and turtles, and they're bringing them into a commercially traded arena. So they're not just going out and catching these animals and then butchering them and then eating them, like for their families. They instead are using them as a form of currency and bringing them to market to sell wholesale. So it's not just, one civet cat, it's 40 civet cats on a much grander scale than what you would consider or what you would think about when we talk about bushmeat. And the reason that this slide has taken on such importance in light of COVID is this is where the scientific community agrees that the pandemic came from. So on this slide, this sad little picture here, these are actually little bat feet that are in a crate. So these are bats that have been captured and taken to a market somewhere. So, all right. I know that we have had some questions about the COVID-19 virus that is making its way around the world right now. And there is evidence that the bats near Wuhan were the incubators of it, if you will. The colony of bats that live in that region do have this SARS virus in them. The last I heard was it did not go from a bat to a person. They believe there was at least one kind of intermediate host, whether that was a pangolin, a civet, some other species that was kind of the jumping off point between the bat and the human. Regardless of if it happened from a bat itself, from a civet cat, from a pangolin, if those creatures had been in their natural habitat, it would have posed no threat. The bats in Wuhan that live in the colony where they have found COVID-19 are not symptomatic, and the people that live around that cave system, the indigenous people, don't have an issue with it. But whenever you bring so many different species into a market that has substandard sanitation conditions and are not the best in terms of animal welfare, that's when you see these viruses really have a chance to take a hold. And that's for a multitude of reasons. For one, you're literally having these wild animals stacked on top of each other for extended amount of time. And so they are constantly sneezing on each other, defecating on each other, urinating on each other. They're getting hurt, they're bleeding. And so it's just an environment ripe for just passing things back and forth. Whereas if you think about something like that in the wild, like that would never occur in the wild. You wouldn't have these animals stacked one on top of each other. Another reason that they think these markets may have been a prime place for the jumping off point is similar to us. When animals get stressed, their immune system lowers. So like if you were stressed in your life and you got a cold, you're going to get kind of taken out for the count, right? Whereas if you're taking care of yourself and doing a little self-care, you get a cold and your body fights it and it's no big deal. Like you don't even get the sniffles. Well, animals are the same way. And so what some scientists believe happened was a bat or a civet or a pangolin had this virus. They were carrying it. They got brought into this market. Their immune system tanked because of the stress that they were put under. They began showing symptoms, shedding the virus at an alarming rate, and then that's how it kind of got out. But this was, I think, a very important quote from Bat Conservation International. Again, they released this statement to really drive home the point that our bats are not a threat to us. Bats in the wild are not a threat to anybody. As long as we are leaving these wild species in the places that they are found, it's not really an issue. And then this was from an article released by Merlin Tuttle, who's amazing in the bat world, talking about how viral outbreaks are rare, they're unpredictable, and he was basically saying we should stop putting so many resources to solving the bat problem and instead put our resources to earlier detection in humans. Because his point is that these viruses mutate at breakneck speed regardless. So you're basically chasing a proverbial needle in a haystack if you're trying to pin down a virus. Because as soon as you get close to pinning it down, it's going to mutate and change. So instead of just chasing our tails, looking for where this virus came from and what it is exactly, we should instead put our efforts and resources behind public health and earlier human detection. Now, there are a lot of things that we can do to help bats here in Texas, in our neck of the woods. The more you can learn about bats, the better, because hopefully that means that if you are with your family, with your friends, on social media, and you hear someone, saying something that might not be true and saying it in a malicious way, you can maybe set them straight and say, hey, that's not right. And bats do a lot of good things for us. Education has extreme power to change people's minds and thoughts. If you look at the picture on the far left, that's a picture at Bracken Cave. I've gotten the chance to go out there quite a few times, and it's amazing every single time. If you haven't had a chance to go visit, as soon as they're allowing visitors again, I would highly recommend you do that. We can build bat houses. Again, there's different plans out there that you can find online on how to build your own. We can support bat-friendly companies. The Tequila Interchange Project is a really neat company that's getting different tequila companies together that are promoting bat-friendly farming practices. And that's all I have for y'all. So we, of course, can take more questions. I was going to share some resources with y'all. All right. So let me see. Now, Diana, is it okay? How would you prefer me to do this, Diana? Would you rather me put things in the chat window, or would you prefer me to just give you like a list?
So we know all the people that signed up for this presentation, I think, correct, Carolyn? So if you want to send us a link or something to your, whatever you're talking about, the resources, we can always send that out, and we send out the information about how to get back to your presentation, the recorded.
If there was another slide possibly at the end of the presentation, or if you want to include it in like a little email to me, I can, I'll send out a link to this presentation to that listserv again, so that people who couldn't come have a chance to watch it and learn. And I think that's a good way for us to kind of get some of that information out there. More bat love.
Yes. We can never have too much bat love, especially now. I actually had some heartbreaking encounters with some of my school groups. I was engaging with them virtually, of course, and they have known me for years, and some of them would say, well, Miss, what's your favorite animal? And I was kind of taken aback by that. And I was like, oh, I love bats. Like, y'all know my favorite animals are bats. Why are you asking me that? And they all said, oh, well, we thought it wouldn't be now after what happened. You can't like them after what they did. And I knew exactly what they were talking about. And I was like, what do you mean? And they said, well, where they made everyone sick. And so even in groups of third graders and fifth graders, like they're hearing it from the news, from their parents, who knows where. And so we're already starting to see some bad press from this, unfortunately. And you know, bats already have a PR problem. So
We do have a question on the chat about the backward knees. Are they like the squirrel knees that can go backwards or forwards?
backwards knees. I'm not sure. I don't know about bat knees.
Another good question is, do all bats roost upside down?
Yes. So bats have evolved to kind of have that unique niche of utilizing inverted roosting spaces. And so, to the best of my knowledge, every single bat roosts upside down. Now, they do roost in different places. So, like some in caves, some in Spanish moss. So, like eastern red bats like to live in clumps of Spanish moss. Um, but they all roost upside down. That last picture I had of the white bats against a green background, those were Honduras tent making bats, and they get them palm fronds and they chew them so the fronds kind of fall down and make a tent, a little waterproof tent, and then they get up and they roost in those little waterproof tents that they make for themselves. So they're pretty stinking cute. Oh, please talk about tendons used to hang on. So that is a question I get a lot. How do they not just fall down as soon as they fall asleep? Well, their little feet are kind of made backwards from ours. So if you were to rest your hand just on the table and relax it, your fingers naturally kind of fall open and they get very lax. But bats, the way their tendons are, when they relax, their fists tighten really tight, and they actually have to think about releasing. So whereas we have to think about making a fist, they have to think about opening their fist. And so when they fall asleep, their little feet just grab on tight.
Could you tell us a little bit more about white nose syndrome? What exactly is it, and what does it do to harm the bats?
Yes, what is it? So I can never say the name of it correctly. Let's see if I can pull back up my screen so y'all can see the scientific name of it. I always just butcher it anytime I try to say it. But it is a fungus. Current slide. Okay, so it's a fungus, and this is the name right here. Diana, do you want to say it?
Nope. PD.
There you go. We'll call it PD. But that is the fungus that causes the syndrome, the white nose syndrome. And it attacks basically hibernating bats. And we see huge mortality rates in hibernacula. And that's just a big fancy word for where a group of animals hibernates. And when these bats go into hibernation, they get this white nose syndrome, this white fungus, and it causes them to have that fuzzy look to their snout that you see in the picture. It also grows on their wings, and it can actually eat holes in their wing membranes, and it causes the bats to wake up in the middle of winter. And so they come out of hibernation. There's no food. They can't really fly because it's eating holes in their wings, and they have seen some hibernacula have a death rate of like 99%. Just decimated these bat colonies that were living in these caves. Now, I did say that we have it here in Texas. It has been found in Texas, but to the best of my knowledge, it hasn't produced the syndrome yet. So what I mean by that is, like you can have like you could have PD in an area, but not have the disease present. Just the agent that causes the disease is there. But Diana, is that the most up-to-date information?
I think they may have found one bat recently this year, maybe, that died from those, but I could be wrong on that. I'm not as up to date either on it.
Yeah. I did a training with Mammalia, who's from Bat Conservation International, and she was the first one that kind of made that distinction for me. Because even though you have the agent that causes a disease in a location, you cannot have the disease, because the disease is the symptoms, right? When it gets into an organism and it causes those symptoms, like that's what we consider a disease. So yeah. A lot of work is being done on PD and white nose syndrome. Like I said, it is an ever-evolving situation. If I could compare it to something, I would almost compare it to the pandemic we're in the middle of right now. And I'm sure y'all have all felt this way, but it feels like every time you turn around, something new has happened. And, first they say this and then they say that, and well, this happened and now this has happened. And it's just like you feel like you can't even keep up with everything that's going on with it. Well, for a long time, that's how I felt about white nose syndrome. Like just everyone was trying to work on it and figure it out, and it was here but not here. Oh wait, never mind, now it's there. And it was just such a fast evolving situation.
Someone stated that they don't think it gets cold enough here in the winter for the fruiting bodies to reproduce and colonize on the bats. And someone else mentioned that they've heard that it's in Liberty County is where it was found. Do you know anything about that?
I'm not sure what county it was found in. Yeah, I'm not sure where
So I can jump in if you want.
Yeah, please.
A bunch of different counties within Texas that have the fungus. There's only certain species that they're worried about because they do go into hibernation. There was a bat found with, or I guess the fungus was found on a bat in Liberty County. It's not the Raffenest big-eared bat, and it was not found in that colony. So it has been found on some Mexican free-tailed bats, which is kind of unusual because they don't hibernate, and so they're able to fight it off. I'm trying to think of where you could go. If you go to the Bat Conservation International website, batcon.org, there is a map, and it shows nationwide all the different locations where it's been found, the fungus has been found. And if you zoom in on Texas, you can see the different counties.
I think that can be about it, guys. Let's see what time it is, 7:44. That has been an amazing presentation. DeAndra, thank you so much for coming to us. What I'll do is when we save the presentation, because there are still a couple of questions coming through, I'll let you go ahead and look at those. And if you want to, write up a little answer for us, I'll make sure to include that with what we send out to the people who have been viewing this tonight and the people throughout the state who are on the Texas Master Naturalist listserv. So they'll have an opportunity to see it also and read some of the good chat that we've had and watch the wonderful presentation. I'm so glad we had your expertise and you, Diana, to be able to jump in and help with questions. I really appreciate everyone who did tune in tonight. If you're a Heartwood member, you've got 0.25 for your chapter business. And you have, help me do the math, somebody. Okay, 6:15. So an hour and a half for advanced training. Okay. So if y'all have any more questions, you can drop them real quick into the chat. If not, then our presentation and our June chapter meeting are complete. Thank you, DeAndra. Thank you, Mari, for finding DeAndra to come and talk to us